Blessings and welcome back to our 32nd episode in our journey through the zodiacal faces. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth, and I'm here again with brilliant astrologers David Fisher and KD Dayton. Thank you both for being here. And we are here for Aquarius II. Welcome back, Aquarius. So the dates for this decan are January 29th and 30th through February 8th or 9th. And let's go ahead and dive right in. Austin Coppock calls this heaven and earth. T. Susan Chang calls this celestial navigation. And the Hermetic name for the minor arcana, which is the Six of Swords, is the Lord of Earned Success. So that's the Mercury in Aquarius card. And that introduces us to our Decan co-lord, Saturn, and Saturn being the major lord for Aquarius. And then Mercury, or the magician, we see back again as the co-lord for this decan. So that's kind of a welcome card. We did have the Empress last time, but we're going to see how much the mercurial energy sort of changes this Saturnine Aquarian energy. And just to remind you straight out of the gate that the sixes are the second decans of the fixed signs, and they represent more of an accomplished or an accomplishment, like a practical best, like almost like a 4 would or something like this. So just keeping that those kind of like generalities in mind as we dive in. Do you guys have anything to say about the combo, or should we just kind of let it flow as we go through the notes from the authors?
Yeah, I wanted to mention something before we get started, which is about the dignity or lack thereof of Mercury in Aquarius. I think T. Susan Chang mentions this a little bit in her chapter, but I think it deserves kind of a mention up front that Mercury doesn't exalt in Aquarius. Mercury doesn't have its domicile in Aquarius, and yet it functions really, really well in Aquarius because Aquarius is an air sign, so it shares a similar element as one of Mercury's signs, Gemini, and it has that sort of like crazy professor or mad professor vibe. Mercury in Aquarius, it just signifies like a well-working mind a little bit. So just something to keep in mind, because no matter what modern astrologers might say, no hate, Mercury does not find dignity here.
Yeah, I guess it's the higher octave method that they might be using, and T. Susan goes into that. But Mercury and Saturn. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Oh, just Mercury and Saturn together, they tend to have a deep, long-lasting like mental energy, because again, we're dealing with the mental suit, which is the swords, or the mental energy, which is the air. And we know Mercury really does well with those types of energies. So I think it's given in this air sign. And I think T. Susan says that this decan is the only airy sign that hosts Mercury as a co-lord. So we think of like Mercury's flight here in a lot of ways, or just Mercury's abilities to, use that air quality. We've seen Mercury as the major lord of Gemini, of course, but as a co-lord to another planet in an airy sign, I think this is the only decan.
And I want to push back a little bit on Mercury has no dignity in Aquarius, because this is also a modernist thought. We do have some dignity for Mercury in Aquarius, which is triplicity. That's why, like you guys are saying, it does well in an Aries sign. That would be true also in Libra. I think where Saturn excels a little bit for Mercury could be not only because it has a decan or some terms in rulership in the beginning of the sign, but because Saturn, as you're saying, also gives it structure as well. It gives it more capability for Mercury to take things at face value, let's say. It gives the right words, it gives the right way to define a structure.
And also speeds up Saturn's slowness a little bit too, where you get that kind of like archetype of Aquarius that has like a lightning bolt of a thought, or like some wild, crazy idea that just comes out of nowhere. I think that's like the brooding and the sitting that Saturn has, and then that quickness of that liminal space that Mercury can provide, the sharpness of mind. Because we have sharpness of mind with Saturn, but we have slowness and density and things like that. But we have willingness with Saturn to like go deep and be liminal and think things through. And then we have the quickness of Mercury. So I think they kind of benefit each other in some ways. And you know,
we were mentioning like Saturn in some previous videos. Saturn has to do with lack. And so I feel like Mercury, as we've said before, in the five of Pentacles with the first decan of Taurus, which is also Mercury ruled, it was a juncture of Mercury with the Pope or the Hierophant. And then the Magician was also this card of trying to find through circumstance, through that five energy, things that you could pick out, you know, that would be useful for you. Here, you kind of have the same energy, but it's more conceptual. It's like, I can see this, I can create concepts for this that will allow me to work with it in a way.
Yeah, when you're thinking about like lack and like what Mercury brings, Mercury, and this was like my one kind of like note, I guess Mercury here reminds me of a Robin Hood. I know we mentioned that kind of archetype before, but it's like robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, because Mercury is the merchant, right? And it's like a trickster. And so it wants to bring that quickness. And Mercury and Saturn together can be quite deceptive and sly as well, but they can really get on in that way. And it really brings something like what Mercury brings to that lack mentality, which is like, oh, you're poor, you're downtrodden, you're on the outskirts of society, let's just pick their pockets and just redistribute the wealth or whatever. It's a very Robin Hood merchant Mercury feel here. Okay, so T. Susan was talking a little bit about and I think this is going to link to what one of these kind of like points Austin is making. She was saying like in the Five of Swords, and I'm not sure if we emphasized this enough last time, but I just want to kind of highlight it here, where the Five of Swords, the last decan, the first decan of Aquarius, we see emphasize the inhumanity suffered at the hands of others. So maybe the outcast that doesn't necessarily choose it as much. I know we talked about the rebel and choice and autonomy. Where maybe the sixth, the decan we're in now, the second decan of Aquarius, emphasizes the kindness of strangers. And again, I get a little bit of that, like what does it give? What's giving, that Robin Hood thing, like the kindness of strangers, those little luck pieces. And when we think about, you know, T. Susan goes, the Six of Swords, right? Like she's like, it's this respite in what is other kind of like otherwise like a mentally jarring space to be in this Suit of Swords, where she says like we think of like fear and grief and conflict and all this, and why do we have that in the swords? And she talks about like how the mind creates suffering. And I think that's really something to look at here when we're talking about like the swords and why we suffer, and that sort of like mental affliction, because it's also Saturnine and it's also Mercurial. And that's kind of where the Magician steps in too, because it's like perception in a way, you know?
It's something really interesting that I remember reading, which I think would be cool to mention now, is about how Chang notes, and I didn't realize this before, that in every single one of the sword cards, the eyes are either closed or looking away, and that is a pretty Saturnine activity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's that part that I was thinking about, like no one's eyes are open, no one can see, and you bring that again talks about like our own consciousness being averted. So that's very Saturnine. And also Mercury works in that realm of like where to put your consciousness, how to put your consciousness. The mind is suffering, right? Then where's the perception of the mind, and all of those kind of liminal spaces. If T. Susan looks at this as like, respite from the Suit of Swords, I feel like it gives that Magician, gives like that autonomy.
It is a character that is transiting in between worlds, right? He talks to the rich that give the means, the material or access to the material stuff that they need. They resell it. They take the prime matter from the poor people to the rich as well to sell as and I wanted to say also that the sixes, they are a part of each suit that is correspondent to the sun in that planetary correspondence from the tree of life. I'm not well versed, deeply knowledgeable in that topic, but the sun is the archetypal perfect being, right? It's like the prime example of what beingness should be for a certain thing. And all the sixes, I've heard this before from other masters of tarot, are the perfect expression of their suit. For that, one of the reasons perhaps is that association with the sun. And because of that, it makes sense that it would be this mercurial association, right, with the Six of Swords as well, because only with Mercury, you have a way to find balance within the mind, right? And in a way that we're going to get deeper into later. But it's just that's why all these associations of, wow, thank God we're at the six in the suit of swords, because it is the most difficult of the suits.
Yeah, and so Austin Coppock in 36 Faces talks about the second decan building bridges between exile and the citizen. So charting liminal spaces, which we see in the six with the boat and all of these things. It's like the space between. And he talks about it being able to touch multiple shores, but being beholden to none. And he likens this to the Thoth science deck, the Thoth deck, which calls this card science. So it's only the method of science which can be consistently connected to the shore of the known and the unknown, which I really, really like, because I feel like that's so perfect to describe this space of Saturn and Mercury together.
I think that means we should expect a very juicy science deck card for this.
I know, I can't wait. I was thinking the same thing. I was like, ooh, what's the science deck gonna bring? I can't wait. Let's get there soon. So the mastery of the space from one shore to another brings certain benefits, but the nature of commerce and the benefit of transaction from goods from place to place is kind of like a ferryman or a science. It's where markets emerge kind of by being able to bring one thing to the other, the shores of the known and the unknown. But then he's saying it's not just the liminal spaces that Mercury can move through or move among. And it's not just merely the bridge from the known to the unknown, but because we have this, I think he's saying because of the Saturnine quality here too, we have the ability to bring the ideal and the practical as well. So I think that's really interesting and sciencey as well, to be able to bring it manifest. It says, for the Swift's planet's sacred space is every road but no place. And I wanted to read T. Susan Chang here because she talks about Mercury the ferryman, Mercury the merchant, and it's just a beautiful invocation. She says, he who knows all roads and passages, he whom is no way barred, he who guides the lost souls from one realm into the other. And then Austin's talking about Mercury as this lord of dualities and the space between them. And I feel like that's very much like that insider-outsider dynamic that Saturn has too. So this is where they kind of work together well.
There's an evolution of thought, again, bringing back to an idea that I've brought up before. Between the decans, you go first decan, second decan, third decan, you have an evolution of a thought perhaps. And the middle decan is the stabilization of what started in the first. So we still pull into this, the idea of I left my people, I left the place where I grew up, I left my culture because I was not fitting in there. And now I have to create my own reality again. What am I? What are the concepts that truly define me, right? Which is a continuation of the star topic, but also, again, this mercurial task of naming things, like Adam named the animals.
Yeah, and the ideal and the practical as well. I just wanted to bring briefly in, and then these are pretty much my notes on Austin, but I wanted to bring in another tie from Austin and T. Susan, where he talks about, we're going to talk about the phases, and we'll hear more when we talk about the Picatrix, but he talks about how the space with this card is like generally perceived to be pretty good or formidable, right? But then the Yavana Jataka is very terrifying. It talks about a man who looks like clouds at sunset and protruding teeth and all of these kind of like, we see fear there in this image. And the Yavana Jataka is not the only text that does this. So the second decan of Aquarius has an image of terror in the Yavana Jataka, as well as in the 36 heirs of the zodiac. So this is that fragmentary Hellenistic text that Austin includes in his book. And he talks about the god Phobos. No, the word Phobos means fear. And Phobos was one of the twin sons of Aries. And the root in English would be like phobia, but it's a little bit translated a little bit different, because phobia can be like a fear of any type, where the word Phobos specifically denoted the panic which puts men en route to battle. So it's like a battle panic, essentially, this name of this god. So he goes on to say how it's both wise and terrifying and all this. But T. Susan talks about another avatar of Hermes. And she says that this is Hermes, and I'm not going to pronounce it. I'm not going to try. So there's this avatar of Hermes that's said to live by one of the rivers of Hades. And this river, there's 5 rivers of Hades, and the one that Mercury lives by is the river of lamentation, and how she talks about lamenting being, giving voice to the mental suffering, or giving voice to the suffering. And I thought that was just kind of like a beautiful tie-in to Mercury there, and why we might see some of those Phobos kind of like fear or panic, or like living by this river of lamentation and Hades, that kind of thing. And then Austin goes on to say that it can be both wise and terrifying. And so I think that is a callback in T. Susan's book with that Mercury image. And then he just kind of wraps up with saying that this is a face of independence, living one's own principles, connected to worlds without being completely beholden to them, and the connection of the orthodox, the unorthodox, the known and the unknown, which we see.
Without being completely pulled into them is a thing to highlight, I think, in all that you just said as well.
And I think this is really interesting, because we have a fixed sign, but an air sign, right? Aquarius. And then we have a fixed decan, because it's the middle decan. But then we have this movability of the character of Mercury that I think really helps out this decan. It gives like one little bit to move. Like if you're afflicted in the swords, you're afflicted before and you might be afflicted after. It gives you like a quick out. And that's how I see like the ferryman. It's like we see our chance to go, or there's only this one chance, or it's got kind of a depressing vibe, because the people are looking away. And you don't know if they're exiled, or if they're like escaping, or like if they have a place to go. But then T. Susan sees it in such like a optimistic light that I was like, wow, it almost gives you a chance to escape.
It is almost overly rosy. But I do want to mention on that topic, though, that Mercury kind of stabilizing this decan, that to also take this in a different symbolic direction, if we think about Saturn and its Aquarius domicile as the rebel or the revolutionary, Mercury is very important to that. Mercury is very important to the process of opposition, of protest, of revolution. It's really important to get the message out, to be able to verbalize and communicate the things that need to change. And so we can take it to that symbolic level as well, to really see how, again, Mercury here and the things that Mercury is doing here are really giving voice to things that Saturn wants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think T. Susan, I think reading this Decan chapter made me understand the first Decan even more. She talks about the risk that drives the fives of swords to like do the game or win the battle, the winners and losers, right? And it has like, it wants to take a risk. It's almost like a gamble. Well, here it kind of feels like you have no choice but to take the risk. And it almost feels like a reprieve in that sense. Like you might not know, like maybe your home is destroyed from the tower and you don't know what's happening on the other end, but now is you get this chance to go, like an escape.
When we get there, this card, the Six of Swords, really, really, really reminds me of the Eight of Cups. And so when we get there in Pisces, I think I'm gonna have a little more to say about this.
Another association that I want to make, and could I mention the Picatrix already, or should I?
Yeah, you can totally.
Yeah. So I want to mention the Picatrix before I make this association, but it'll make sense in a minute. There rises in the second phase of Aquarius a man who looks like a king, who permits much to himself and abhors what he sees. This is a phase of beauty and position, having what is desired, completion, detriment, and ability. This is its form. Now, why is this interesting to me? Because we have seen before the image of an improper king or someone held up high without having consistency or the real the regalness to be put up there, let's say. And that was in the opposite decan from this one, which is the middle decan of Leo, which is ruled by Jupiter, an energy that is opposed to Mercury's by sign rulership as well. So in this case, perhaps we have another side of that being raised up high by your peers without deserving much. And here we have this being outcast without being deserved, but still kind of the same image of a man who looks like a king, not a king per se, as the other guy was raised up, but the man who looks like a king. He mimics the king in a way. He imitates the king. And so it is, and the image of debility for me, it's like, again, that image of using Mercury to try and mimic an image of structure that is acceptable, humanly acceptable, but that includes the reality that excluded you, that includes your personality, that includes your individuality in a way.
I think it's interesting too, because he permits himself much, right? And he is sort of flashy, but he's not a king. So he looks like a king. So you're dressed in gold and chain, like you're looking the part, like you're flashy, right? And you have like the money. It's the people that buy designer that maybe can't really afford it, or they buy designer, but they don't even really like it or something like that. But they have this like flashy, kingly vibe, but it's also, and it wants like beauty for position maybe. But it can have that completion. It can have those things. It can have what's desired, but it also says detriment and debility. And it also says he abhors what he sees, right? So it's like you get the things you want, but it's a debility to have those things, right? And sometimes we do see that when people are like all flashy and like whatever, the shows of wealth are, distasteful in a sense or something like this, right? It's almost like
tacky?
Yeah, and also in a way, it's again back to the Robin Hood. It's almost like hood rich, right? Where it's just like you grab a bunch of gold and stuff and you just wear it all at the time, So it's like actually kind of debilitated. You're not really a king, or maybe you don't really have it, but you're just flaunting it. And it's like the debility of the rich, kind of the debility of the riches, even if they are redistributed. They're kind of discussed.
Let's get started with some tarot cards. So we've seen the star in Aquarius 1, the last decan, but I have a few different depictions here of the star from last time. I want to mention something beautiful. I don't know, Elsa, did you read the bit about the expanse of space and the dark, salty depths of the ocean?
Oh, yes. And I was absolutely in love. I kind of wanted to read some quotes from that part.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to do that, actually.
Let's do it.
I'm going to read a little clip of this because it's really beautiful. And I do think that it really speaks to something interesting related to the relation between water and air, the mind and the emotions. So She says, according to the Golden Dawn system, swords correspond to the element of air, cups to the element of water in tarot, swords the intellect, cups the emotions. In the Genesis myth, God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Here we have the first division of sky from sea, suggesting that the dark, starry realm of space and the dark, salty realm of the ocean were once as one. I think that this is kind of a nice place setting for the star that we have to talk about this time. On the far left, we have the Rider-Waite-Smith image of the star, and right next to it, we have a traditional tarot deck. I really should have done this earlier, but I need to appropriately attribute it as the Soprafino version of the traditional tarot. And what I really want to draw your attention to here that T. Susan Chang mentions in her chapter on this Decan is the presence of birds in the background of the star card. This also does do something to reference that kind of story of Genesis and some ideas about the beginning of the world. With the Garden of Eden, there were definitely birds. And it's beautiful. In her chapter, T. Susan Chang mentions how bird song was thought to express the secrets of creation. This is not just in Christian tradition, but in other stories as well, including some Egyptian mythology, because in her discussion of what that bird might be in the background of the star card, one option she suggests is the ibis, which is a waterfowl that is associated with Mercury. It's the bird of Hermes. So that is a guess kind of as to what this bird in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck might be. But she mentions two other possibilities too, which I also found somewhat compelling. The first being the dove of Genesis. Again, if the painter or the conceptualizer of these cards had any sort of Christian bent, which I'm sure they did in some way, or familiarity with the symbolism, this could have been a dove of Genesis, which ties into a mythology of the Great Flood, which is really common in a lot of different cultures, a lot of different cosmologies and mythologies, tautologies even. And that flood myth does correspond to what I read earlier, the separation of the firmament from the sea, from the sky. They all come back to this kind of emotion and intellect, as above, so below. Another very important mercurial hermetic phase to consider here.
Yeah, I thought that was beautiful. Like the dove after the great flood, right? The dove brings the branch to the ark to show that there's hope. And that's a very star-like quality. And I know that you had talked about in the old star card that it was like almost like a resurrection, like Jesus figure, or like a man in this sense. But we get that also with, in the star card of the in the Scapini, it shows this blackbird in the back, and I always thought it was a crow, and I always thought it was Saturn. So I was always like, oh, because the crow is Saturn
related to Aquarius. Yeah,
exactly. But then we have the eagle in the star card from the mother piece. We have a red bird in the God, I'm not even gonna remember all the names. My mind is not quite there today, but we got but she said, and I love how she puts it too, because she's like, is it an ibis? Is it,
who could it
top? Like, what are we seeing here? But I'm really glad that you brought in that sky, water, kind of like sign of hope. Great flood.
It's so beautiful. And yeah, so there are a lot of different bird depictions. One of the other ones that Chang speculates that bird in the Rider-Waite-Smith card might be is a dove, the swallow of Venus. Again, with a little bit of Christian iconography there, because there's something about Venus being the morning star and a reference to Christ there. So it's just a very interesting piece. But in the one right to the right of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, we have the Soprafina deck, and there's an owl in the background of that, which is also super interesting for the star card to have an element of like wisdom and intellectual acuity at the same time as being very intuitive. The wisdom piece is really key.
Yeah, I was gonna say the death piece as well. It's another Saturnine kind of like wisdom out. It's like what Austin was saying. It's wise but terrifying. It's like wise but also representing death. So That is really interesting.
The epic tarot deck that I don't have, I don't have at hand here, but, and I'm not going to show, but there's this depiction that shows a woman coming out of woods, like she's coming out of the dark woods into a spotlight almost, like where there's open air and light shines on her again. There are flowers and all of these renewal kind of symbolisms. But yeah, just the owl representing as well this callback to death and to rebirth and to this process of Venus going under the earth that we mentioned in the previous episode and coming out, and just like the renewal of your desires with the star card, right? Being like, okay, I'm in a new situation. I don't really know what to do here. What attracts me, right? What calls to my attention the most?
And it's the light, it's the star, it's the luminaries, it's the sky, it's the great beyond. And I want to go back to what you were talking about, Katie, with the mind and the heart and the intellect and the great flood, because when we think about flood or the birds or any of these things, that's what we're thinking about, David. Like you're saying, with the flowers are coming out of the dark or coming out of the forest or coming from the tower, we're thinking about this sense of renewal. And what do we get when we have renewal? Like, it's kind of terrible, but we're like starting fresh. We kind of like have to have hope that there could be something more or something different. But
I mean, the thing that kicks off the renewal is the tower. The tower kicks off the renewal. So whereas the tower I've often interpreted in shorthand, in a tarot reading as something you can't do anything about. It's catastrophic. Okay. It's going to be tough. You have to just accept the uncertainty and prepare for being unprepared, essentially. In that same vein, the star I've often thought of as like forced blessings. Like, you can't do anything about it, but something's coming. A flood.
Yeah, totally. It's like a breakup or a death or something where you're like, oh my God, I can't imagine so much more pain or being stripped down or being forced into something that I don't want. But then there's got to be that like new hope. There's got to be like, okay, what does life without them look like? Or, okay, like if someone passed or a tragedy happened, okay, like where do we rebuild? Where do we start? But there's that initial shock and pain. And before you even get to the luminaries that are going to illuminate you as what to do, what not to do, you just have the star. You just look up. There's just some rays on you. There's just a little bit of that, like,
I've got to say that I know that it's not going to be the most popular relation, but it is so much the story of the birth of Christ and the Star of Bethlehem. So that's what we see in the Michael Ulrich deck on the far right. This is a depiction of, just somebody witnessing the Star of Bethlehem. And in fact, you referenced this, but I want to make it explicit. I did some research on the history of the star card. And before it was a naked woman kneeling at a stream, it was a naked man kneeling at a stream, because, oh my God, naked ladies, no. But back in the 1400s, when the first kind of prototypes of tarot cards were coming into circulation, and there were kind of illustrations of this in certain prayer books, the star card was represented by the three wise men on their way to Bethlehem, following the star to the place of Jesus's birth. So I'm not a member of the church, but I don't know, David, if you had any comments.
Yeah, I want to comment on that, because Jesus is referred to as the morning star, in the sense that he is the one that guides us towards the light. He is the path to which through which we reach consciousness of our divine nature and of the Holy Spirit. We become possessed by it when we become conscious that it's available to us, basically. And Jesus is the one that creates the logos, or the path that we can trail to reach that kind of illumination. And so the correlation here with the star card is clear, because you don't yet know where you're going to get. You don't yet know what's at the end of that path, but you have to follow that sign. And to put it into more practical terms within ourselves and in our routines, we have these moments, again, as Elsa was saying, when we are impacted by some breaking point, some pivot in our lives. And after going through that process, we realize, oh, actually, I still have good feelings that I can feel that I didn't know, now that I'm stripped of this particular thing that I was so attached to, and that resonated my value system with in a way. Now that I've lost it, I can see that there are other things calling out to my attention. There's another glittering feeling here that
There's
is
hope.
pulling my attention towards this one thing, hope. And that gives you hope, right? And so you're like, oh, and I'm talking about like subtle attractions. It could be like, oh, I realized that I've been writing more on Twitter, and that's inspired me to write more. And that's something I hadn't done in years after that. So I could go back to writing. That kind of experience where you allow yourself to just feel something that allows you to feel good within a scenario that previously was only destruction, allows you to get in touch with yourself again. But that's before going through the moon and the sun.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that brings us back, if we can circle back just to say something more about the sky, water, and the great flood in the mind, in the heart, because you know, it's almost like it's almost like the star was stripped of her whatever, because the tower fell. Like, she doesn't have her clothes, she doesn't have her adornments, and she's forced out. But then she has there's like this peace moment where she still has the pool and she's still distributing. It's like in those moments of depravity or whatever it is, of complete tragedy, all you have to do is like look up, and like the luminaries haven't shown you what's next, and you don't even have the strength to build, but you're in this moment of just like, I can look up and there's rays shining down upon me. It's almost like grace, because I think, hope is the key word for the star card, which is a very Jupiterian word. But I think this is like really interesting to find hope lying in the midst of like a Saturnine sign.
Mhm.
And just something about that mind-body connection, or being stripped and just being able, it's almost like, yeah, like you were saying, the sparkles are the glimmer, not the thing itself. We're not rebuilding yet. We don't have the idea yet, but somehow we know that we're making it through this tragedy, or we've been left behind. We haven't been killed in the tragedy, or we haven't been taken, right?
And again,
now,
yeah, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and again, Jesus would be a good correlation mythologically to the star card, because he is called that one that points to God. He's not God. He's not the Father.
Right.
He is the one through
Right.
which you get to the Father, which is more of the luminaries kind of thing.
Well, and you think about, it goes star,
Moon.
moon, sun. It's the Father, Spirit, and Holy Ghost, right? The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Yeah, and something like,
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
and like the planets are still guiding us, right? It's just that glimmer. It's not the full light of the luminaries, but we're still compelled to look up at the sky, or we're still compelled to get that like drink of water, or we're still compelled to like move forward because we don't really have another choice. And I feel like that's really Six of Swords too, is like they're moving forward because they have no other choice. It's not necessarily forced exile, but like a quick opportunity to escape, or a quick opportunity to do something. And it's like,
And there are
yes,
several passages. Sorry?
just like the glimmer of the planets and the fates still being there through these dark times, that gives that glitter. It's like a soul glitter. It's not yet a plan, it's not yet manifest, but it's like a spark that like renews you, or like a spark of hope. But it's like, it's not yet manifest. It's still in that liminal space of being like just the grace of the idea washing over you, or the grace of something deeper, something bigger to live for, that there's life still happens after a tragedy. And to build on what you're saying a little bit as an example, there are passages in the Bible itself, like in Lamentations, where they exiled the people from the Hebrews, basically. And in Babylonia, they were exiled. Funny how it's called Lamentations, right? Because that's the river that Mercury lived on in Hades.
And it's the book, in the book of Lamentations, you find this beautiful passage that is like him saying, I think in the 3rd chapter, maybe there's still hope. He's like humbling himself and being like, okay, I need to do this, confess what's bringing me to anxiety. He does exactly the process that we were describing earlier. Confessing and putting into words, so his mind can bring back that which gives him hope. It's a beautiful passage, and it's been referred to me in times of crisis many times before by Christian friends and stuff like that.
Yeah, and so T. Susan, sorry, I'm going to try to bring it back now, and then I'm sure Katie was going here with the flood myth and the sky and the water being one, like the mind and the heart are almost like inextricably linked. She said, so when we speak of the mind and heart, the intellect and emotion, the sea and the sky, above and below, we're speaking of elements that were once joined at some level and still are. She says, William Lilly's stars incline, they do not compel. The above and below may be distinct, but what separates them also joins them. And we know this through times of conflict, like the head and the heart, like,
Yes.
you know, like you can overthink something or compel a feeling, or you can have a feeling, compel a thought. And, you know, they're just almost inextricably linked, and they can feel the same sometimes. Like ancients didn't know where the feelings and the intellect necessarily,
Well, and the overlap is intuition, because it's a little bit pattern recognition, omen recognition, and a little bit feeling. So, I mean, I think that's a very astrological
Well, that is
mandatory.
that is the idea that Schmidt synthesizes in the lecture, same in the other, right? Of like, you have, I at least from the way I'm seeing it, like the brain or the mind, the analytical mind, the conscious mind, in a sense would be this more solar-like thing, while the lunar part would be, or the other-like part would be the heart.
Sentiment, nostalgia.
Yeah, the
things like this.
subjective part.
Well,
yeah,
so
and I think
I had that underlined, starred, highlighted in my book, this stars incline, they do not compel, because this is actually something at the basis of our astrology practice. I think the form of astrology that we learned. So yeah.
Yeah, and you're getting to the luminaries, you're getting to like where we bring consciousness around like the shadow side and the emotion, and where we bring the consciousness of the sun and selection and the mind. But I think like the idea of harmonizing our head and our heart is like a form of like enlightenment or happiness or whatever. And humanity maintains the hope, or at least I do, I maintain the hope that I can align those things, and that you know, that is an idea of like, oh, when do we find happiness? When our heart is not conflicting with our mind, and when our mind is not conflicting with our thought or with our emotions. And that means like spiritual alignment, right? That means emotional fulfillment. But we know that the mind is a treacherous place, and we also know the heart is a treacherous place.
Exactly what you just described actually is the point of this science deck card, this depiction of the star called compassionate action. Everything is in balance. You know, it really does harken to the temperance card, you know, but there's a real, there's like a choice here where science, which this is the Lord of Science, the Six of Swords, science can be used to either support life or to take it away. All right. And so there is a choice that we can make to maintain balance, such as in an ecosystem. This character here is pouring a beaker and a test tube into a stream that is lined by plant life, a lot of different flora. And it's all related is the point. Like what she is pouring into there is going to feed into the plants on the banks of the waterway. Because there is a sense of common purpose when we're all operating on the side of supporting life, you know, that we're all operating in the same destiny, essentially.
And this really reminds me of the Hermetic deck, Lord of Earned Success, because earned success to me is another way to say compassionate action. You know?
True, yes.
And so we've got this defeat that happens to us in the 5. And here it's like, man, you did a good job. You've earned this success. You've gotten through it. Like, and to me, it's like, no matter what my head said, or no matter what my heart says, I can take compassionate action to the other, right? And it is about like, you know, if we take that compassionate action to ourselves and to the other, we do earn the success.
Yep.
And if we do have our head in line with our heart, meaning we're in alignment with our energy bodies, or our mind and heart is in line with our ideals, or they're not conflicting with one another, that is like a compassionate action on ourselves. And it is an earned success, because it does take a lot. Like if you meditate and you take your temple, and you work and take action in your life to like make sure that your head and your heart are in line with each other, which is a very difficult thing, practice or action to achieve, right? It's a difficult science, it's a difficult balance. And when we do that, we do get that earned success.
Yep.
It's not an easy task,
especially in the context of science. It's like a reconciliation between ambition and compassion. Like there's something to be had in between the two.
Science is very much like meditation or contemplative thought, where it's like a neutral, you're supposed, ideally you're in like an equanimous or neutral space of observation. So I think that kind of ties those concepts together of like head and heart and observing the mind, because anyone who's tried to practice like any quote unquote real type of meditation knows that you're observing the breath, you're observing the mind, you're allowing what to arise, those types of things. And I feel like that's kind of like the rigor of scientific thought, the way that we know it is just observe it. And we also know that just by observing things, we tend to change them. So we know that the mind and the heart and the intention and the living being also affects its surroundings.
Yes.
So
an ecosystem, it's all together.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I love the science deck. This is a beautiful depiction. I want to point out that the Little Dipper is here in the corner, and it's also 7 stars. There's a little 8-star up there, but it's really again, yay science deck. So I have I have some depictions here of the magician, which we have also seen before. Mercury is a co-ruler of many different decans. Elsa brought up an excellent point earlier that when we look at the Rider-Waite-Smith version of the 6 of Swords, we see a ferryman ferrying some people across the stream. We'll see that in just a second. That ferryman is Mercury. So in one way, we could say that ferryman is the magician. As a reminder, for those of you who might not be as into astrology, maybe as tarot, Hermes is the messenger god. He is also the god of well, I would say travel, also like short distance, like transit sometimes is a more appropriate categorization. But something else that is often associated with Mercury, and that I believe you all would agree with too, is that there's an element of the astrologer and the magician, because it's putting words to things that are more felt.
Absolutely. I mean, Mercury is definitely an astrologer. I mean, you can find that even in practical delineation in a natal chart, but you're also looking at like the elements, and you're looking at what is above is affecting what is below, or vice versa, or some kind of a correlation or correspondence there. And yeah.
Mercury's the alchemist. They will understand which elements to pull from in which determined moments. So again, that correlation, that balance between feeling that you were mentioning, Katie, and intuition, and it's feeling and what? Intellect?
Yeah.
And so you're able to create your reality, again, as Elsa also mentioned, through your mind, through your observance, through the way you think of things.
100%.
Think about saying hello to someone in the store in the morning without a smile, and then smiling at them. The effect that is going to have is very different, and you choose when to have those interactions, and according to your moods, right? Or according to some
words having power. And that's what the alchemist or the magician does. It speaks light, like, that's why we have magical language, or that's part of alchemy, is like,
and then the song that comes to mind in that is like my I think favorite things from the Sound of the Hills. What's that?
Sound of Music.
Sound of Music. Like when the dog bites, when the bee sings, when I'm feeling sad, all that, those tower moment significations from when life gets you down, and then she's like, I simply remember my favorite things, and then I don't feel so bad. it is a magical kind of formula there for us. Very Disney-like formula, but it is. And you have that kitty there that kind of makes me think of that song. He's remembering his favorite things, like he's playing with his favorite toys there.
Exactly.
You know, those
He has
are his
everything
elements.
he needs. He has
Everything he needs. I love that the
Um,
fact that his elements are his toys, the things that he knows, the things that make him validate his reality or like
except for the swords,
stimulate
which are
him.
his claws, which I love.
Yeah, lovely.
But yeah, no, that's a really good point, David. What you say is that every single suit of tarot cards is represented in the magician card. He has all the tools he needs at his disposal. He has the wands, the cups, the pentacles, and the swords. But even more than that, what this signifies is the ability to manipulate your environment, or at least manipulate your thought patterns to accommodate the environment that you find yourself in. So that's why I have those two cards there of the Cat deck and the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. But the middle one I really want to talk about because this is funny. This is a very interesting depiction of the magician. Again, this is the soprafino version of a traditional tarot deck. And what we have here is somebody who looks like they're a cobbler. They're working on shoes, which I don't know how much more appropriate could be for Mercury. Mercury, the messenger god, the god of short travel. And so I think that in reading about this card specifically, I read that there were maybe not conflicts, but it was an interesting translation to go from Il Bagatelle. Tarot was originated in Italy in about the 17th or 16th century. And that word in Italian, il bagatelle, doesn't necessarily mean tradition, essentially. It means wielder of a wand. And based on some of the original definitions of this card, some alternate translations of the magician could have been the juggler, because he's juggling many different elements, juggling many different items, or the grifter, because it is casting an illusion over these tools to create something else, such as magical thinking that you were kind of referencing, David, with our thought processes and changing the way that we think to meet the need. So I found that super interesting. He's holding aloft a glass of red wine in this, and apparently that's supposed to be a depiction. Now we're getting into sociological depictions of the 16th and 17th century in Italy, but there was a new thing emerging called the middle class. And so this figure is supposed to be depicted by that middle class outfit of the time, which was inherently fueled by the spread of commerce. This is a merchant. This is a merchant class individual of that era. Again, just being very mercurial.
Crafty.
And please
being
don't
crafty.
hold it against him.
No shame, no shame. I thought that was a really interesting deep dive into the magician card that I went into.
I definitely think that like the black hat and the red wine is like kind of a call to a more Saturnine version of the magician, because it's very much about practical, like what do you produce, and shoes being very practical. Obviously shoes with wings are like a mercurial thing, but it allows you to get, like shoes allow you to get from one place to the other without, like more swiftly, essentially, or something like this, so just him being like a practical craftsman in Aquarius or in Saturn sign, or even being like a drunkard, or even that black hat, which is like a call to like a Saturnine figure. Or this is a double Mercury ruled sign, so by triplicity and by descending order, a Chaldean order method. And so I just feel like it's got a lot of those Robin Hood qualities, like kind of rebel qualities, but
and
also
you're saying Robin Hood, I'm thinking again of that association of being opposite to Jupiter in the second decan of Leo, and being like maybe that Leo like personality is opposite, because it's this mercurial one is able to spot the inadequacies, like the king has no clothes kind of thing.
Mercury, what is Mercury but an artisan?
Yeah.
Especially in Virgo.
An artisan, a craftsman, a tradesman, a trickster, a robber, a thief.
Those latter ones are Gemini Mercury. But yeah,
a creator, I mean, just in general, like a creator. And I think here it becomes very practical with this guy, working the leather and working the shoes and, making his way up the whatever social ladder to the middle class or whatever it is. He looks like a Saturnine mercurial figure to me.
yeah. He looks wizened, if not jaded.
Also, you see a little bit of that smirk, like,
Yeah.
there's wisdom there, but there's something tricky here as well.
It's like, I'm going to get my money's worth out of this interaction.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to zoom in a little bit or try to on these cards here that we're looking at, the Six of Swords, which is the minor arcana card that represents this decan. It is the Lord of Science, which is a really interesting name for it. I understand why, but it's really interesting. So what we have in the Six of Swords as a general meaning is the idea of journeys into the unknown, necessitated journeys, even refugees or finding refuge someplace is often referred to. And how this relates, in my opinion, to both Mercury as the magician and Saturn as the star, is that the ferryman, the navigator, never loses sight of his guiding star to take him where he needs to take people to go. So you can see that very clearly in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck that is being depicted. And I want to note, and I should have noted this earlier when we were talking about the sea and the sky, but almost every single swords card has water in it. Very interesting thing to consider.
It is, and you have navigation in both of these cards, and it's like, if Mercury is the poleman or Mercury is the magician, and here he's feeling fine, he's feeling in control, he's bringing lesser fortunate people from one place to another. T. Susan Chang also invokes Mercury, saying, I'm not going to read from the Orphic hymn of Hermes, but she talks about Hermes being a friend to mortals in need.
Yep.
And I think, whether these are like the husband has died or been killed in the Five of Swords battle, and they need to like leave the town, or, the mother and child look a little desolate, or maybe they're escaping just in the nick of time. And so they're trying to shroud themselves, to conceal themselves, which I hadn't really thought about. I'd always thought about it a little bit more bleak, but this deep dive really made me think that it was like a great escape and like a stroke of good luck.
Yes. And, we talked about the magician, Mercury, being the ferryman here who has the pole and is pushing them along the river in a flat bottomed vessel. And that really is a call to what we referenced earlier with an avatar of Mercury being a guardian of one of the rivers in the underworld. Because that is the sort of vessel that they imagined would be taking people across those different rivers to forge to the other side. The other thing I want to mention here is that in the bottom right of this card, you'll see what are choppy waters, but it really does look like the Aquarius glyph over and over and over. Chang points that out in her chapter, and I'd never realized it before, but just the depiction of still water on one side and choppy water on the other, I think is really interesting for the six.
It's a separation, right? It's like being able to overview the situation and make decisions based on both sides. You're like having a clear mind. Again, that detachment that we mentioned, that you take enough distance when you practice meditation, for instance, to see something for what it is, without personalizing it, without making it your guiding star. You can then find the path, the middle path, when you do that kind of separation of,
Yeah, it actually really, it just keeps calling to mind a little bit the temperance card when we talk about the middle path and finding balance as in compassionate action. So
compassionate action, that rod, like it's not a rod, like it's a row going into the water, right?
Yeah.
Compassionate action.
Yep.
Yeah, and the friend of those in need, like calling on Mercury as a friend of those in need, and maybe the Saturnine archetype might be in need, or whatever, the lowly or downtrodden. What the fuck that was gonna be?
Another thing that I wanted to bring up is the triplicity part of Mercury in Aquarius, because I love the science deck depiction because when some planet is in triplicity or has the triplicity lord's power given to it freely by aspect or other things, you have the winds on the sail of this little boat here. So it's that's what the ancients compare the triplicity benefits, the triplicity lord's benefits to a planet or to
that's so
a
cool.
luminary.
Like the wind in the sails.
Wind in the sails. And I believe that the power of Mercury within its triplicity perhaps could be highlighted here symbolically through that.
And it's
I love
also,
this.
absolutely. And like Saturn being ships or seafaring,
Yes.
it's like we wouldn't
Speaking
have
of choppy
that.
waters.
Yeah, speaking of choppy waters and seafaring, you wouldn't have that without the ingenuity or the craftiness of being able to like hold air to transverse waters or whatever, you know? So that's a very deep like archetype. And that's why that's another way in which air and water were like extremely connected or kind of like can't be separated, just like our mind and our emotions can't. Like through meditation, we sort of make space to have the emotions arise, have the thoughts arise. We might notice where they're connected or where they're influencing one another. And of course, they are influencing one another. But when we start detangling them slightly, we create a little bit more space for them to exist like as they're in their own nature, but they're obviously and inextricably linked. And just the way the seafaring would be, right? You have to have the stars to navigate. You have to have the wind for the sails. It had to be very crafty and ingenuity.
And you have to know the currents.
Yes.
And you have to know the currents, and you have to know the winds, and it's absolutely you know, the way that people connected, merchants connected, and the world connected. So like merchants and merchant ships being Mercury, and ships and navigation and water traversing is Saturn. So, you know, they're really deeply sort of linked here. We get to really see that archetype come through.
The symbolism is beautiful. And I'm going to try to do my due diligence in explaining the scientific theorem behind this, but I might not do a very good job. So feel free to cut it if it doesn't make sense. So this is supposed to be in relation, the little equation on the back of the boat is in relation to quantum electrodynamics, also known as QED, which shows subatomic behavior. And subatomic behavior is not intuitive. And so it was like a really big deal that they were able to find a way to depict that in a formula. And specifically, there was a scientist named Richard Feynman who created diagrams to visualize that, which is essentially what you see on the back of the boat. Visualize.
He was a fine man.
What?
He was a fine man.
He was a fine man, Feynman. And he basically created a map for navigating the subatomic level of science. So celestial navigation and subatomic navigation all in one.
It's interesting how it's not intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
But that's hot.
So hot.
Talk about
Speaking of Aquarius.
Yeah, Aquarius, that's hot. You know,
I didn't even think of it when I brought it up, though.
That's a little shout out to Paris Hilton, who's an Aquarius. But you know, I don't know if we're going to specifically talk about this, but just while I'm thinking about it, because it's kind of like not been explicitly said, but I've been thinking about it the whole time, which is the Aquarius glyph, which is as above, so below, like two lines, one of air, one of water, kind of that's how it could be represented, right? Like the movement of the air and the movement of the water and the little glyph. Yeah, so just wanting to explicitly maybe just throw that in here before we move on from the topic of the air and the water.
Absolutely. All right, so over to the right here, we have a couple of other depictions of the Six of Swords. Now, just like you, Elsa, I think the Scapini deck was one of my first tarot decks, and this is a decidedly not respite card in the Scapini deck, the Six of Swords. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it because I think that this card actually has more to do with the Yavana images that you mentioned, images of terror, of Phobos, and of battle panic That's literally what's happening here. I didn't know that before.
Yeah, it's getting into those classic depictions. Definitely the beastly kind of descriptions in the Yavana Jataka and in the 36 heirs of the zodiac. And it is more in line with the way you would think about this suit of swords or something, like the beast turning on the man, even though he's trying to escape or he's trying to get to the castle or like whatever it is. There's this golden road to the castle, but there's some kind of like beastly fear in the way. And I think beastly fear in this case could be represented by the mind and the emotion, because half the time we're afraid of what's in our mind and we're afraid of what's in our emotions when they're sort of turbulent or unknown, and we don't even breach them because of our own sort of like fear and mistrust of what is going to be in those waters or in those minds, you know, and kind of the fear of the unknown, essentially, the fear of the beast within.
Absolutely. And I also found it really interesting. Again, before this, I had a couple of vague ideas about what this card might mean, but then your comment earlier, David, about in the Tree of Life, this Decan being oriented with the sun, a solar Decan. So I had no idea what that yellow river.
The number 6 in the Tree of Life.
Yes, the number 6 in the Tree of Life. And I had no idea what that yellow river might mean, but I do think that it is related to that solar energy and the lightning as well. That solar fire, also bolt of inspiration in a very mercurial sense. Oftentimes now we associate lightning with Uranus, but I do believe that that sort of momentary thought is very mercurial.
Like it's like something startled the horse and
Yes.
the rider got knocked off and the rider's like, wait, don't crush me, you're just startled, kind of a thing.
Yep.
But this also reminds me of the king in the Picatrix. Like maybe he is like going to this castle on this golden road, but he's not really a king, but he wants that kind of like prestige or glory as he enters the city, but he gets knocked down from it, which is that kind of thing we see in the Picatrix, which is like not the defeat, but what do they call it, the debility or something like that, or you know, kind of almost like the feigned appearances, or when your vehicles don't work out, which is another kind of like kind of perversion of that mercurial thing that we were talking about with the vehicle, with the transportation, with the boats, like it not being there's a call
back to the Picatrix here of being a face of debility with what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Of these kinds of things again going wrong. And so we here have a king impeded, perhaps a king or a soldier or whatever, but someone impeded to get to the castle that they were supposed to get by those swords. And the horse is startled, meaning that your tools or the way you're using to get there is not adequate for this task, you know, in a way, and you have to re-envision.
Or like not concentrated, like it is kind of like that mind emotion thing, like the horse gets spooked, it's out of its mind, it's out of its emotions, it's kind of like, you know, got that element of where we could
kind of the strength card a little bit, but in a way that is not quite strength. It's like
it's almost like the ability to like not tame the beast, or like when the beast gets like out of hand, like how do we handle it, or we get trampled by it. Like we do get trampled by our emotions and by our thoughts and by our fears and all of that all the time, you know.
Mm-hmm. It also kind of rings a bell to me about the Garden of Eden's myth, where you have swords, flaming swords, and angels keeping the gates of the Eden for Adam and Eve not to come back. And I think that once you acquire a certain type of knowledge or consciousness, you become detached from your previous reality or the things that were secure to you. So see the castle in the background, perhaps as a representation of the tower, even things that are unreachable anymore because the tower fell in a way, I think, for this card in particular. I really like this depiction. It makes me think of all these different ways.
It's kind of outcast from the city too, that same kind of like outcast from the city, or is he trying to get to the city but he can't, and like now he's having like vehicle malfunctions, or kind of like he doesn't have that mind heart taming like you see with the strength card or whatever, like something's kind of out of whack, like the mental stability of the entire thing is out of whack, and now he's like at the mercy of like the bestial nature, I guess, which you see in like the Yavana Jataka, like fiercer images. And we
Saturn,
know that
beast
the
of
no,
burden.
right, beast of burden, which is, Saturn, and then, horses are very 12th house. But it's also like we know that the mind and the heart can be sort of like a beast of burden in a way when they're not, fully aligned, or when our fears come up or our projections come up or whatever that is, when we're being somehow downtrodden or outcast or can't get into the walls of the city or whatever that situation might be.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to how perfect it is when you talk about Phobos and Aries' sun and the battle panic association. This figure is in like a gladiator costume, but a black cloak, which seems like he might have been leaving undercover, under deceptive wear.
Or coming undercover like a spy.
Yes, exactly.
Coming or going, like, yeah, you're right, with that Saturnine coat. But then we see that king who's like dressed like a king, but not really a king, kind of like deceptive vibe. Again, for the Picatrix.
Right. So again, Skikini deck does not disappoint either. Always a very interesting take on it, even if a little bit more like tragic or
no, very dramatic, but at the same time, I think it's perfect. Like, it really speaks to you in a specific way. And this is what I like about variety of decks when you are offering tarot readings, for instance. I always send pictures, like I select a particular arcana from a random app wheel that I have, and I will send a picture of my reading decks for my clients, so they will pick which one they want to read from. And it's always amazing how the deck will have a specific message from a specific depiction of that specific card that will speak to the natives, to that particular person's situations more deeply.
I love that. I used to do that, and then I got very like, I don't know, nervous about letting people pick crazy decks that they didn't understand, essentially. So, and they just like to look up the artwork. But I do think that is a super interesting and intuitive way to get in touch with what the person's like feeling, if not their aesthetic.
And good to mention, and just good to mention, because it does have to do with kind of that oracular space that the magician comes through, the oracular space that Saturn could be associated with like the unknown or the liminal of like, if I was to, just pick any old deck and I was dealt the Six of Swords, if I was dealt it out of the mother piece, I would be like, oh, this is a message of hope and promise. Nice. And if I was given from the Skipini, I'd be like, oh no, but it truly is like, but anytime you get the swords, you're kind of like, oh no, anyway, if I got the woman with the boat being pushed too, I'm always kind of like, oh no. But
the little TikTok audio, there you go, and nothing can go wrong. Oh no.
Exactly.
So the mother piece deck is the last one here that I wanted to talk about on the far right. This is a depiction of a group of women with 6 swords, a sword each, kind of skydiving. Unfortunately, I think that the interpretation is that they're falling to their death, which is interesting, but it is ultimately a very positive card because they have the swords where they have their intellect, but they also have the roses in their hands, which are supposed to represent their passion and their love and their kind of appreciation for beauty and aesthetics. So what this card is supposed to mean is clarity, overview, a perspective, such as one might get in near-death moments, about what is important, what is the ultimate purpose of this. And it's also associated with the idea of science and evolving, which I think really plays into the Lord of Science phrase. But the last thing I want to mention about this before we get into a discussion is that those evergreen trees on the bottom, there are 13 trees. So this is supposed to represent a grove of the goddess, and potentially these are priestesses or followers of the goddess.
It really made me think of that right away. And I might have just known that in my subconscious from having worked with this deck. But it also reminds me of like martyrdom, and martyrdom kind of reminds me of the outcast in and out group that we talk about with Saturn, because it's like if they are falling to their death, they're all in their ceremonial white and they're all like coming together, like dying for a reason or making something of beauty, or like kind of falling. It almost looks like graceful, like they've risen up and then they're not falling, or that they've risen up from some kind of like a
Like,
grove.
what is gravity? Maybe you're going up. Maybe they're coming
it's
down.
Yeah.
Who knows?
It's interesting that they could be priestesses, because you see the 6 is that number of service that has to do with, in numerology, if you know, it's like that number has to do with caring less about one's own need if you have it in an important influence over your life or something, like and giving more to the collective, being more looking more towards the collective in a way.
So many swords seem to be sort of related to this idea of individual suffering and independent like prisons of the mind. But yeah, this going back to what Elsa said at the beginning, the 5 of swords and the 6 of swords are interestingly more about small groups than they are about the individual or a person. And I think that the Mother Peace deck is a really good example of that.
So before we continue on to the closing chapter of our episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Comment your thoughts, and please drop an emoji. It really helps the algorithm. And we're at 300 subscribers now, over that actually. So you guys are awesome.
We pre-recorded Aquarius 1. We're gonna definitely like release some stuff for you guys, but sorry if the celebration is coming a little late in your minds, but yeah, we're past 300. Thank you guys so much. Let's get to 500. Oh my God.
That's our next goal, 500. So
I know.
share this.
Yeah, please do. And just continue to like, and you know, the comments and emojis really do lift it up and kick it off. So thank you guys so much for all the support in any way you have, liking, commenting, sharing. So, and thank you for being here.
Check us on Patreon.
Watching and enjoying the content, because like when I say it's my love language, yes, it helps the algorithm, but we don't know, we're just regular like people devoting a lot of like love and time and energy to this. So when you connect with it and you let us know that, we're like, oh my God, like we don't know who these 300 people are, and we haven't pushed this to our like friends and audiences. It's just you guys out here on YouTube. So like that's a lot to me. Like 300, I know it's like, you know, 100,000 is like not a lot to people like in TikTok world, but we appreciate you connecting with this and coming back or interacting in any way. So thank you very much for getting us to 300. Let's get to 5.
If we were a church, this would be a considerable congregation by now. So thank you guys.
This would be a considerable congregation. Can I mention 2 nativities real quick before we totally
Yes,
close?
let's please do.
There are 2 people who I think are really interesting depictions of this Decan, because they have their sun in this Decan of Aquarius, and that's Bob Marley, who is, it's a very interesting person to have represented here. I don't want to go super into that.
I do though.
Okay, go ahead.
Just quick, because Bob Marley is such the soul rebel, right? Like
Yes.
like people see him as like, again, like a if they're not really in reggae culture or reggae music, you would just think of like Bob Marley as like fun loving, easygoing, maybe like joint smoking or like hippie culture or something like this, but not at all. Bob Marley was a revolutionary and a prophet and a complete like, you know, a prophet to a lot of people, a complete genius, and offered a lot of solace in his music through his speaking it like it was, through his rebel spirit, through bringing Rasta culture to the forefront. And he was a controversial character as well for being, you know, mixed race in that culture, and just his history, and also a controversial character in many ways in his life, I guess, in relationships and
in true Aquarian fashion, you know, you could see in the art that he put out, as well as like stories of his private life, that he really cared about the collective more necessarily than the individual, whatever. He really was a humanitarian.
Yeah.
And
Go listen
he
to
had his
Big
own
Dick.
faults. He has his own.
Oh yeah, for sure.
faults,
I'm
for
all like,
sure.
he's a prophet, but
No,
like,
no, but yeah, like.
but
just-
yeah, and definitely, and
So was Rasputin.
Yeah.
oh God. Okay,
I swear
so
to God, I thought he was a Pisces for so long, and now it all makes sense.
yeah, it does. So Bob Marley, and go listen to Small Axe or If Whom the Cap Fits, or some of those old school like Bob Marley songs. I'll link them below.
That would be awesome. And then the other one is Rosa Parks. I love it because there's the mercurial element of being on a bus, which is short-term transit, and then the Saturnine Aquarian element of being an outsider who took a stand. And I just think she's perfect for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Those are hard-hitting, amazing examples of this nativity.
And then I should just mention, I'm sorry, third last one, Lisa Marie Presley. She passed away just a week or two ago, but her birthday also falls in this decan. She was the daughter of Elvis Presley. So.
And isn't Paris Hilton here?
I was going to say Paris is next time.
I love you.
I would have her. Don't worry. I would have her if she was here.
I think she might be next time. Yeah. We're all like, that's hot. Okay, this has been hot. And thank you. Shall we conclude with the poem? Would you mind reading the poem? By the way, I mean, I just saying this to KD is like, I don't know if T. Susan's book is like getting better the more that I read it, or if we're towards the end and it's like more juicy. But like every chapter, I'm like, oh my God. And the poems, like,
they just start hitting you harder and harder. The last poem just broke me. It broke me.
I know. And let's just say, not only a thanks to our viewers, and keep watch because we are going to do a 300 sub special video, and we're going to be doing some giveaways like we promised and some extra special things. The 500 giveaway is huge. So watch for that video. But, not just thanking our viewers, but thank you so much to Austin and Susan and all the deck creators, because we really have used their ideas and their work as scaffolding for our work. So thank you very much to them. I know they're not probably watching this, but just for you all to know that we really give a lot of thanks to
and if you guys have any ideas, please leave them in the comments as well for us to do any specials that you'd like to see in the future.
We've already been talking about things that we're going to do to count the decans in the future years. So
yeah, we totally know exactly what we're gonna do. Like, it's not like
we're gonna pull you. We're gonna pull you on YouTube. So answer our polls on what you would prefer for your giveaways and all of that. So, but I think for the 500 one, we're gonna do a big giveaway, and for this 300 one, we've got a couple good ideas. Maybe I'll pull you, or maybe we'll just let you know when that video comes out. But that video is where you're gonna comment, subscribe, and get a chance to take part in that giveaway. So watch for the 300 sub video.
All right, I think I'll read the poem. This is the poem at the end of the chapter called Applied Science by Neil Bowers. Because 3 left turns make a right, and the way down is the way up, the way in, the way out, but most of all because the beginning is the end. Where we are going looks remarkably like where we've been, ourselves growing small, headed out for the horizon, looming large, coming back, smug with solutions for such easy puzzles, devising a machine to settle everything, immense in our littleness, tinkering with the world.
Matao kako bersama yo demikian soba da soba kena matai banak kau di mana demikian soba dan soba matai banak ujuna baikana kamaya tak ongai esa